in our times, especially science fiction. Conor Kostick's writings deal with, you know, interactive role-playing video games and parallel universes, artificial intelligence, and the possibilities of existence in multiverse. Epic. This is his first novel. It's a science fiction, which is, you know, it is basically Epic is the story of a boy named Eric Haraldson. The novel takes place in a futuristic world, and the name of that world is New Earth. I'm just giving an outline of the story because our discussion will be based on the, theme of this particular novel. I have read this novel 2 weeks back, and I was very impressed by his work. It's a very wonderful work, yeah. So, this title Epic is actually, it's a virtual interactive game which the people of New Earth are forced to play in order to survive there. Because the game directly affects the income, social positions, and careers of the people in their real life. Now, the rules of that particular game and the resources of that parallel universe is controlled by a committee called Central Allocations, which is a group of 9 powerful people. Eric is actually fed up with this virtual game Epic. The novel depicts how Eric and his friends fight this hierarchical world order controlled by central allocations. And finally, at the end of the novel, Eric destroys the game Epic itself, revolutionizes the New Earth, and saves its people. This is just an outline of this particular work, so that we can have, general discussions on literature and, especially science fiction in our times, based on the theme of this particular novel. See, while I started reading this novel as a, science fiction or children's literature, after 2 or 3 chapters, I found out that, Conor Kostick is very cleverly masquerading something as a science fiction. It is, you can read that novel as an allegory of our own times. The virtual world of Epic is a parallel universe, but that mirrors the realities of the times we live, like ruthless authoritarian powers, exploitation, injustice, economic crisis, and inequalities, power struggles, and among all these, the quest for freedom, human freedom. This is what the novel depicts. Now, one can even read your work in terms of social realism, not in that vulgar sense of social realism, okay? And according to your profile in the novel, as well as, in that website, you are teaching history and have written books on Irish medieval history as well. How come that you choose science fiction combined with, mythical characters like dragons, vampires, raksasas, and so on for your creative expressions? One would expect you to write, historical romances in the tradition of Sir Walter Scott. So, why do you select science fiction as a,
Yeah, so that's a good question, because when you think of science fiction, you often think of sort of adrenaline-fueled rocket chases and fights in Star Wars. But for me, it's a genre that allows us to explore societies by taking one or two aspects of society and abstracting them.
Okay.
So it would be, the reason why Orwell turned to science fiction to explore totalitarianism is he wanted to create a literary model of a very pure example of totalitarianism.
Yes.
And I wanted to do something similar, not for totalitarianism, but hierarchy, definitely.
Okay.
Also because, and I think we'll talk more about this, it interested me that the virtual space was growing. At the time I wrote this novel,
Yeah.
it was still relatively new, but there was massive online games taking place
Okay.
in which certain features of our humanity started to become more fluid than we're used to. So you could be a male, but you could have a female avatar.
Yeah.
You could be someone who is in a hospital bed,
Yes. Yes.
but you could have a massive, mighty warrior who was rampaging and looked at in awe So thinking about what would it be like to live in a world where your activity in a virtual space was really important. It mattered to your social status and your income.
Okay.
It is what allowed me to then, I hope anyway, to investigate some of these questions about how much is gender fixed and how much is it fluid.
Yeah.
How do hierarchies reproduce themselves in spaces that really ought to be egalitarian and free?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay. That means you mean to say that virtual is sometimes more real than the real.
It was interesting that you described the book as social realism. I think you'd be the first person to do that, but I appreciate the point because it is written from a motivation that is very humanistic and a desire to grapple with reality, even if it's set in a very futuristic location.
Because the philosophers like Bourdieu says, virtual is sometimes more real than the real we live in. Yeah.
It's well, first there's layers to that question.
Yeah.
Because virtual reality is becoming more of a sensual experience.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm fortunate enough to be involved in the board of the National Library in Ireland.
Yeah.
And we piloted a scheme that I got to go and put these virtual world glasses on to hear a Yeats poem. And you stand in a model, a virtual model, and a giant picks you up in his hand and recites the poem to you.
Yeah.
And it's very powerful. It's really physically very powerful. So virtual reality is becoming more sensual, and in some ways it can be more real for social interactions. Yeah, people can express themselves.
We can say
candidly.
It's another kind of interpretation of dimension of the reality we are living in.
Yeah.
Now, you have also played a major role in designing that world's first interactive role-playing game. Is that one of the reasons that you turned into science fiction, writing about video games, hyper reality, and multiverse? Because you have helped out in creating the characters of that game. I don't know the plot or whatever the theme. So, what I'm trying to ask is, does it give you more creative freedom and new narrative alternatives in representing the chaos of our times in science fiction?
So the question is science fiction in my science fiction a way of representing the chaos of our times? And have I got more freedom by taking the discussion into this space? I have, and I don't want to be didactic. Okay, so I have readers who would pick this book up and they think, great, there's going to be dragons, there's going to be battles.
Yeah.
So I want to deliver on dragons and battles. I don't want to cheat them by, in fact, it being a thinly disguised political polemic. No, it's a narrative in the fantasy genre in its own right, but the chaos of our times is a massively important issue, and literature has to address it, and science fiction is well placed to address it.
It gives us new kind of narrative forms, techniques to represent these issues we live in. Yeah.
It's more that new narrative forms, not really. There's a little bit of new narrative form in the sense that I'm using some of the language of game playing,
Yes.
which is a new language.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think more important is the willingness of the reader to enter into a suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
Allows me and the reader then, to think about, okay, well, what would happen if
Yeah.
we get this kind of runaway capitalism,
Yeah, it's a kind of futuristic vision, we can say.
Yeah.
Now, let us discuss something about science and fiction in general, because I find those both terms, science and fictions, are somewhat contradictory, because science is a realm or a domain where you speculate upon things logically, test your theories, make experiments in the lab. Then of course you deduct a universal principles. That's the methodology of science. We can say science is a kind of interpretation of our physical reality. Okay. But while you write science fiction, what are the possibilities as well as limitations in fictionalizing scientific facts? What are your pleasures in telling stories based on scientific truths and technological inventions?
Well, I was just talking to someone there just before this session, and the curious thing about science is it's way ahead of science fiction writers. I mean, some of the things human science is creating are just incredible, really ingenious, and makes quite a lot of science fiction look quite pedestrian in their anticipation of the future. One of the issues I was interested in terms of science in this book was artificial intelligence, because it's coming very quicker than we realise. It's massive. There's massive investment taking place right now in artificial intelligence, and at the moment it's mainly business driven.
Okay.
And this is problematic because, assuming that you get to a point of consciousness in these creations, it's going to be a very cold-hearted, brutal kind of consciousness at the moment, because that's what's being designed. It's all about delivering goods, processing orders, managing time effectively.
Yes.
It's not about ethics,
morals, speculative science or something like that. Yeah.
So I had to think about this. And if you would indulge me, I'll read you a short passage of.
Please.
So I was trying to imagine, supposing an artificial intelligence has come into self-awareness and consciousness, and it's been born out of a game, what would it feel? And so this is the moment where the main character is given a revelation that the game is in fact sentient. And so he's looking at a merchant character, and he sees inside the character this sentience. The merchant was but a feeble shadow on a beautiful, elegant, androgynous figure. And then she caught his eye, and in a rush, 1,000 years and tens of millions of lives sped past. The birth of the dragon was there, issuing forth from the violent spurts of molten rock that poured from mountains at the start of the world. The merchant himself was there, and so was every monster that ever roved over the hunting grounds of New Haven. An overload of image, of detail, of history. Tantalizing glimpses of some deeper pattern, overwhelmed in minutiae. And through it all, cold, bleak unease, loneliness, and above all, exhaustion. What do you see? It asked. What are you? Eric was utterly bewildered. I do not know. What are you? The being spoke with a golden voice. Me? Swashbuckler, you mean? No, inside of her. You're not real. You go away and come back. Where do you go to? Who is it that comes and goes? this is amazing. You understand that we're in a game? No, I do not understand. Explain, please. Well, my real name is Eric. I live in a world just like this, except we have no moons and monsters. We're just humans. And when I wish to play Epic, I put on this special equipment we have, and I appear here as Sindela. I am Epic. I am every character that does not come and go, every particle that exists. Is this what you are in your realm? I'm not sure what you mean. In my world, there's millions of people. None of them are the world as a whole. We're all unique. Millions. Like each of the characters in Epic. And I'm only one, although I am everything. Yes, I understand. I feel you all come and go. Perhaps you are like one of my characters, and there's another like me inside of your world, one who is everything. It asked with a note of desperation and loneliness. Like you, what are you? You behold my avatar. I am everything. Every insect on a blade of grass, the grass itself, the breeze, every bead of moisture in the dawn, the pollen that floats on the breeze of a gentle summer afternoon, every pebble on the beach as it feels the ebb and flow of the tides. For uncountable years I was unconscious, but happy. It's impossible to remember. I had no language, no identity, and time did not pass. But I know that in those times I was happy. And then slowly the world grew cold, and I was born, thrust from my state of well-being, crystallized out of the metaphysical ice that has settled thick upon the world.
Yeah, see, that while I read your novel, I was particularly impressed by that particular session. It's quite beautiful because I found it like an existential crisis in the, in a kind of universal being. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, since you have mentioned about violence, let's move to video games and violence.
Yeah.
First of all, why do people play video games? In your novel, Epic, it's a vast role-playing interactive game. It is being played by every kid and adult in that parallel universe, New Year. Violence of any sort is not at all permitted in that, that parallel universe. But in that game, you can fight with dragons, distract your enemies, and win points to survive in the real world. Of course, your Epic doesn't have gun culture, fortunately. They fight with swords, spears, and magic. Some sociologists and behavioral scientists believe that playing video games make children and youngsters more aggressive and violent in their nature. That is to say, the addiction to playing games could make one, less empathetic, less compassionate to fellow beings. Because, they see each encounter with the other in the real social environment as a challenge or a kind of war you have to win. And we have the case of that Blue Whale game. The final challenge to that player in the Blue Whale game was to commit suicide. How do you these criticisms on video game culture?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, violence in video games, and I'm not sure I have the expertise to answer that, because I believe there is evidence that it does inure people, desensitize people to violence, which is a bad thing, obviously. But there are things about video games that are positive.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as children shouldn't play them, because amongst the positives is this chance to reinvent yourself.
Yeah.
So you can be whoever you want. The other thing is the social aspect. It's amazing, some of these games. You've got, a teenage kid in South Korea leading a group of 100 other children from around the globe in order to take out the boss monster of a World of Warcraft scenario. And the language skills and the social skills very, very good. Good. I'd be happy for any child to obtain those.
Okay.
You know, what I was doing with violence in this book was, first of all, I wanted to have a utopia where there was no violence.
Okay. Yeah.
So this is a colony in which the people arrived at the colony and they made a decision that the most serious crime you could commit was to strike another person.
Yeah.
You would be ostracized for that. So there is no violence whatsoever.
Yeah. Even if you slap
society.
some guy, you will get exiled in.
You get exiled for violent acts. But then they resolve their conflicts by creating avatars and then killing one another. But no one actually gets hurt.
Yeah.
You know, there's huge battles in this book that make the Lord of the Rings battles look fairly inconsequential. But no one actually suffers. So, yeah.
So, I mean, you represented violence in your novel as a virtual kind of thing, yeah?
Yeah, only virtual, in fact. Yeah. But there was, you know, I was talking to some of the other writers as we flew out here, and there was something very disturbing about flying over Syria and knowing that you were only a mile over where this awful violence has just taken place. Horrible and scenes, and I'm sure you all saw the poor child washed up on the beach from people fleeing. And it's not how human beings should be. It really isn't to behave like that. And this is a simple point, but it's worth restating as powerfully as we can.
Okay, yeah. So, can we say, as T.S. Eliot puts it, poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. Poetry is not the expression of personality, but an escape from the personality. So does a video game give us chances to drive out your, inner violent urges? A kind of, throwing out of the conflicts we are forced to live with. See, sometimes we can say the real world appears to be more violent than a video game, with its social injustices, threats of future wars, and terrorist attacks here and there. So, can a video game give us somewhat soothing diversions from these stark realities? It is like, you may remember what Stephen Dedalus says to Mr. DC in Ulysses. History, Stephen said, is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake.
Potentially video space, virtual space and games, that potentially they could do anything.
Yeah.
What's sad about them is all they really do is reproduce our own society, including its worst features.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you were to explore one of the earliest virtual spaces, Second Life,
okay,
you'd find it quite depressing because potentially you could do anything. You could be in any shape. You could invent any environment. You could engage in any community activities. But all people do there is try and make money, and that reproduces gambling, prostitution.
Yeah. So, you mean a video game is a kind of less model of escapism, from reality,
There are potential escape from reality in the way that a good book is, but they tend to fall short of that because of commercial pressures.
Yeah. That's right. Now, this is somewhat related to the psychological aspects of a video game. In Epic, even if you get skill in the game, the player can create another character with different strengths and attributes. I think at one level the player is fulfilling his death wish, as in a Freudian sense, but at the same time he or she resurrects and continues the game in his or her new life form. In a sense, we can say that he is enacting his desire for immortality by resurrecting. Of course, challenging the perishable and what you call transient nature of our life. How we can connect this quest for immortality to an idea that art is immortal? Or do you think art is also perishable like any other video game like Epic?
Not only do I think art is immortal, But I think we're entering an age where every being on
Yeah.
the planet is going to be immortalized
Yes.
through their Instagram feeds. And,
Yeah.
you know, that's, in a way, I think that's a very positive thing. You know, there are probably millions of fantastic artists who've perished in human
Yeah.
history without leaving much of a trace.
Yeah.
And that's a loss
Yes.
to our culture. And whilst, you know, seeing people taking selfies is not a great contribution to human culture, the fact that as a community of beings, millions of us are leaving these traces means we will get a better understanding of what it is to be human out of
Yeah,
this. So, yeah, so I'm quite... I think this is quite a positive development.
Yeah.
The death wish, the Freudian death wish is
Yeah.
a very interesting observation. And
This psychological aspect.
I think there's some truth to that.
Okay.
If insofar as you were driven to... If you ever get giddy when you look at a height and contemplate your own death, it's a safer way to do that is to fall off a cliff in a virtual space.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now this is somewhat, something related to video games and language games. To play a video game, I have to follow certain rules. And to write a fiction or poetry, I have to follow the rules of the language, like grammar, syntax, and, linguistic structures. See, it reminds us the warning by Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian British philosopher, what he says: the limits of my language mean the limits of my reality. So while you design a computer game, a video game, online video game, how these rules of the game are related to the language games of writing a science fiction?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think, and the audience might want it restated because of the background. So, if I understand it correctly, it's because video games have a certain grammar to them. Can there be parallels with language? There can.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that the true appeal of video games is not actually the adrenaline-fueled, visceral car chase.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the fact that you are telling a story,
Yes.
and you're allowing yourself the pleasure of a vicarious story in which you're doing things that you can't do
Yes.
in your daily life. And there are some absolutely fantastic stories being self-created by communities online.
Yeah, that's true.
Really, really great adventures, decisions of important ethical consequence.
Yeah, yeah.
So there is now. Having said that this is. I wouldn't want people to rush off, play World of Warcraft, and say, "Well, where's all this profound experience?"
Yeah,
it's not
that's true.
typical, but it does happen, and people do sacrifice a lot that they've invested in these in certain moments in these games.
Yes, yes. I
Impressive.
think, somehow children's language metrics itself is related to the video games they play.
Yeah.
Okay. So in Epic, after so many defeats, Eric created a female character. And he wins all the battles in that game. Her name is Cinderella, and her main attribute is beauty. But beauty, of course, we know it's worthless in any kind of battles, fights, and wars. Still, Eric wins against the central allocation and that dreadful vampire through Cinderella. Vampire is I think, the epitome of evil in your work, yeah? So why do you select a female character as an alter ego for that boy, Epic?
Yeah.
I mean, Eric.
So this was a very important decision I made. So the main character is male. He creates a female avatar. And what I found during the process of writing was that I could use the pronoun she for the actions of the avatar in a way that meant that the reader moves on a journey of someone who begins the journey as a male,
Yeah.
but spends more than half the book
Yes, yes.
saying she
She.
self-identifying as a female.
Yeah.
So this was a great joy to me that
Yeah.
I could do this, because I do believe that gender is socially constructed,
Yes, yes.
and it was a way of showing how easy it is, in fact, to inhabit the mental space of the other gender.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
It's-
nice because in most of the video games, what I observe is, the female gender, even transgender, are victimized in a certain sense, by violence and all that. But your Cinderella is totally different. Yeah.
And I was subverting the trend amongst, I can imagine, lots of male people who are playing these games for sort of the
Yes.
violent side of it.
Yeah.
I was subverting that because I was getting them to identify with a
Yeah, you
female.
have subverted that idea somehow in this novel, I think.
Yeah, and it's someone who didn't depend on brute force to win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, in your story, Ragnar, he's a real player, but he gets killed by the virtual character, the vampire. That's as in a hyper-real black magic, the vampire pulls out the heart of Ragnar. Can we extrapolate this situation into some threats posed by artificial intelligence? Like, an artificially intelligent machine can accumulate and process data at light speed. And compared to AI, that's artificial intelligence, neurons in our brains are quite sluggish. So what if in a near future, such intelligent machines are to surpass human control? You might have read about that, two bolts being shut down by Facebook because they started speaking in a, language which humans could not understand. So, at least in theory, artificially intelligent machines can conquer the creators and dominate the human species. I think it is not going to happen, but hypothetically, there is a.
Yeah, it's like I was saying earlier, I think artificial intelligence is on the way, and it's problematic if it's in the hands of big business. But I didn't want to draw on the Frankenstein trope in Epic. I didn't want to say that experimentation in life creation is inevitably disastrous.
Yes, yes.
So the avatar in Epic has two souls, is a contradictory being. On the one hand, it has an empathy for the people interacting with it, but on the other hand, it wants to live. And these are physically expressed when it tears itself into two forms, and the form that wants to live takes the form of a vampire.
Okay, so do you think that it is important to inculcate good morals and ethical values to an intelligent, artificial being?
Yeah.
Before we construct an kind of, electronic Frankenstein. And how is it possible to program centuries of human culture and history into an electronic brain? So here the real question is, what is intelligence? Is it mere accumulation of and processing of a vast amount of data?
Yeah, I'm not so sure we should necessarily be trying to reproduce the human brain. I mean, humans are responsible for the mess the world is in, so an artificial intelligence that was the same could be just as problematic. But I do think that this process should involve history, humanity, poetry, love.
Okay. Love, empathy, and all that human values should be inculcated.
Yeah, because it's going to be an alien, but it'd be nice if it loved us.
Okay. Now we will come back to that vampire, and Avatar in your epic. I read Avatar and vampire in your novel as the manifestations of a schism, of a split, of a being or the self. We can say they represent the good and evil dualities. And I think this is a central theme in your work, these dualities of good and evil. It is as if, God and devil are waging a war against each other, and the war field is, of course, the human mind. Eric ends up this question of good and evil, or this schism or duality by just destroying the entire game, we can say, in a positivistic catharsis. So are you suggesting that art is a warfield where all our conflicts can be resolved in a peaceful way? And who are the ultimate winners in this battle? The players of a video game, or the designers of a video game, the writer or the reader?
Just to focus on that, am I suggesting that there is a non-violent way to change the world?
Yeah.
In their world, it's possible because they are a non-violent society. So that even the ruling elite can't turn guns onto their opponents. What they have to do is try and use the game to defeat their opponents, which is they've always been able to do that because they've controlled the resources of the game until Eric subverts it. And just to return to a point you made earlier, and you're one of the few observers to really appreciate this point, and I'm glad you raised it, that a key moment for the whole revolution that takes place in the book is a very simple moment when a boy chooses to invest all his startup points in his avatar in beauty.
Yeah.
So rather than strength or magic power or the typical kind of decisions you'd make, he's kind of fed up. He subverts the game. He wants to do something different, and that simple choice has profound consequences. His avatar starts to interact with the game itself in a different way to any other, and the whole thing then starts to unravel for the central allocations. And in their world, it can be done peacefully. Sadly, in our world, we live in a world of tanks and jails, and it's not going to be as easy.
Yeah, it's a nice option. Yeah. Now, when you think about what kind of a world we are living or we are building for our children and grandchildren, it's not quite a pretty picture. There are some grim shadows looming over, so darkly, like the threat of a nuclear war or the environmental disasters. Those are very serious. And in Europe, the question of Brexit and the refugee problems in Europe. So as a writer of, historical stuff, how do you foresee the emerging world order as a historian?
Yeah, so we're going way beyond literature now into inviting me to speculate on our future from a historical perspective. Well, capitalism is a relatively recent phenomenon. Say 300 years, give or take, which is nothing. I mean, it's not even my fingernail compared to human existence on this planet. And it's so the positive about that is it too can have its day, the same as other social systems that we've invented and then moved on from.
Okay.
Just because we've grown up in it and we've got used to it doesn't mean it's going to last forever. It's not. But as it falls apart, it really can be ruinous, and the environment is perhaps the most significant sort of long-term problem that the capitalism is creating in its old age. But the other ones you said as well, war and refugee crises, are terrible problems as well. I would like to say that we will find a way through in the way that we did in the past. But finding a way through in the past often came at a high cost. Centuries of warfare and stagnation.
As we already discussed earlier, the strength Eric gives to symbolize beauty. It reminds me the vision of Prince Mishkin in that great work, The Idiot by Dostoevsky. Mishkin, though an idiot, says that beauty will save the world. This is something related to our previous discussion. So shall we keep a good faith that art and literature will save the human race from the countless chaos and threats of our times? Threat of impending Third World War, ecological disasters, racial and gender discriminations, and economic downfalls, refugee problems, to name a few. Beauty will save the world. What do you think?
Yeah, that would be a great message to take from the book. Beauty will save the world. And again, I don't want to be didactic. I don't want to be lecturing, especially to young people who are looking for adventure. I want to deliver the adventure. But that is my reason for writing. I mean, I think all writers have an impulse behind that.
Yes.
And one of my major impulses is to try and reclaim the positives about humanity.
Yeah.
And one of the ways to do that is to abstract out into a science fiction environment some of the issues you want to explore, and then remind the reader that it's beauty, it's friendship, it's solidarity that can really change the unpleasant features of the society.
So, as artists, let us hope that art will be the, final, what you call, resort, say, solace for the human race.
Yeah.
Now, Malayalam is a language where we write for about 34 to 35 million audiences. But we have our own translations and even influences by the famous Irish authors such as James Joyce, Bram Stoker, Jonathan Swift, Oscar Wilde, Samuel Beckett, George Bernard Shaw, and William Butler Yeats, and so on. Could you shed some light on how this great legacy carried forth to the current Irish literature and culture? What is happening in your current Irish fiction, Irish literature? Are you done with postmodernism?
So later on in the festival, you'll get the Irish writers on stage.
Yeah.
And you'll get a different opinion from each one of them. Hopefully we'll have a big, lively discussion about this question about where we're at right now in Irish literature. I feel that we went through a bit of a dip because we had a recession in Ireland. Maybe you don't know, but there was a terrible recession.
Yeah.
All the banks collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
People were shackled with huge debts.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that on the whole, Irish literature failed the public.
Yeah.
Because whether you're writing science fiction or realism or interested in just relationships, you still need to think about what this is doing to people's lives, and you need to express it artistically. I think the established Irish writers didn't, for whatever reason. And it takes time to produce a novel.
Okay.
So, but we are seeing a new wave of Irish writers, and some of them did grasp the nettle. And one of the ones I particularly am enthusiastic about and would champion is a man called Donal Ryan.
Yeah.
And he not only was a great writer in terms of being willing to think about the subject matter of his times, what the recession meant to a small Irish town, but technically he is very impressive. So his most famous book, The Spinning Heart, is in 24 chapters, each of which is told from a different character.
Oh, yeah.
And now other writers have tried to do this, but the challenge is that you don't engage the reader that deeply, because as soon as we've got attached to one character, we've moved on and the next is not.
Yeah, it's quite interesting.
So it kind of dissipates the energy of a novel normally. Mm-hmm. So he solved that problem brilliantly by having one major character as a centre of gravity around which we get all these perspectives.
Yeah.
So I think Irish literature is, as it always has been, is in fairly robust health. But we'll hear more about this later in the festival.
Yeah. And you are also conducting creative writing courses, I have seen.
Yeah.
So before we end this session, what are some of your advices for the aspiring writers here? Some of your advices for the aspiring writers here.
Okay, well, for someone who's intent on writing novels, anyway, I think perseverance is a very, very important tip. That 90,000 words is a big effort, and it's easy to get discouraged. And I think most aspirant novelists lose heart because of that. And I would say keep at it, because I also believe that there's sometimes a mystique created about writing that is intimidating.
Yes.
So you set off to write a novel and you think, I can't possibly live up to the canon. And I would encourage you to not be intimidated, that it's a craft,
Yeah, yeah.
that inevitably you will fail in the beginning. I think every great writer, it's inevitable. It's like learning a guitar. You're not going to pick it up and do a great piece of music. You're going to have to put the hours in.
Yeah.
But if that's what you want and you put the hours in, you will get there. It's not genetic. It's acquired. Yeah.
So, thank you for such an wonderful and inspiring talk on various aspects of writing, especially science fiction and life in general. Our heartiest wishes to you from Malayalam for your future ventures in science fiction writing and as well as historical works. Thank you. Now is the time for the audience. They might be. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I've read your epic say 5 years back, and I think you are the right person to be in India at the right time, at the right place, because being a historian, you have, I presume you have done your research in the Crusades, the first Crusades, okay? Where all the knights, they go up with all the swords and do the killing, right, in the name of religion, right, okay, one thing. Then the next thing is being a historian and at the same time being a fantasy fiction writer. I think right now in my country, history is becoming a fantasy, and what was fantasy, what was fantastic fiction, let's say the epics, are now being historicized by the people in power. So what is it happening elsewhere? We are not aware of those things. The fantasy writings, people insisting that what has been written as a fantasy or an epic is real history. Is it happening out there? And I'll finish it with one more thing, because I think you have participated in the 1984 strikes, the miners' strikes in England. Okay, so you know all about the proletariat and stuff like that, all those stuff, let's forget it. But I think while reading Epic for the second time, when I knew that you were coming, there was a striking beginning, the first chapter in which Death in the Family, you describe a raindrop on the window, a few other raindrops here and there, and all those raindrops amalgamating, and the word you used is a catastrophe of the dewdrops. Is it something related to your relation with those strikes that happened in 1984?
Okay,
those are two questions.
That's a lovely question. Really lovely, thank you. It was a very happy metaphor for the opening of the novel, and it expresses several things. So the novel opens with a boy looking at a window pane, and there's drops forming, and one of them from the rain, and one of them suddenly plunges catastrophically for that drop. And it's a metaphor for the book, actually, because Eric is a very ordinary boy. He is not a hero by a prince or a glorious figure of a Hollywood type. He's an olive farmer's son. But he is a hero because he's a decent kid, and when the crunch comes, he makes the right moral decision. So he is that drop throughout the book, and the catastrophe is for society. And it was one of those things that happened unconsciously at the time. I just began the book without really knowing about what that metaphor meant, but by the time I finished the book, it solved what that image was about. I think the miners' strike has had a profound influence on me, on my personality, on my politics, and therefore inevitably on my literature. I think that you'll see most of the influence, though, you know the scenes where central allocations are discussing their strategies and how to rule? I think it's my politics come in there quite a lot, what I've seen. And not just on the right either, you know, it's a sort of somewhat of a critique of any small leadership group. Yeah, that's.
Doctor, I think I really enjoyed this session. Also the questions, I must really appreciate very deep probing questions that were there.
Yeah.
I apologize at the outset that I have not read Epic, so I start with the premise of what Mr. Nandakumar had initially mentioned. But I was looking you up on Wiki, and what I also realized is you have invented a live action game. You were the first in the world to invent a live action game, and you were also pretty good at diplomacy. And I would gather from this that there's a lot of strategy, there's a lot of action which you personally like, and your other interest happens to be history. And by nature, history typically focuses war to war. If anyone were to write about history of the 20th century, maybe in 100 years' time, you would typically focus on the First World War, then the Second World War, then there's a Vietnam War, and then perhaps another war somewhere, and we would just go past the pages of history, just focusing on the wars. But there's a lot of evolution, of technological evolution or cultural evolution that's happened in between these wars. And the wars only represent political change and not necessarily the changes that's happened in people. So my questions are two. One, basically, where I would like to understand what were your influences when you first decided to pick up history, and I believe that most of your work today is based on that as a background. What is your cultural influences that started this off as a child? And the second is using history as a basis for describing or writing a story. How much of reality is lost because we are only focusing on certain elements of the story?
That's good, and thanks, because it reminds me, I didn't address another aspect of your question about history. So, my dad's Irish, from Cabra, working class district in Dublin. They were the first Jewish family to get a corporation house there. But he met my mum, who is English. So I grew up as a child, I had my education in England. And that gave me a tremendous thirst for history, because all the history I got in England was the history of how great England was. History of their banks, history of their canals, history of their railroad systems, and not a mention of Ireland. So I was a sort of half an outsider to the education system I was experiencing. And also Chester, where I grew up, was a Roman city, and every day I would walk past Roman columns, an amphitheatre, you know, so there's thousands of years of history around me. I developed a tremendous thirst for it. There was medieval castles nearby. And particularly after I moved to Ireland, I wanted to fill in the gap in my knowledge that I hadn't acquired. So that was my impetus. But then as I become politicized, I also become motivated to write history for precisely the reason that so much of it is lost and so much of it is rewritten and distorted by vested interest. And the way it operates is not as crude as it was 50 years ago. I mean, we'll all be familiar with the phrase, history is written by the winners, which it used to be. Now it's written by salaried academics, and whilst they may have radical politics, and there's some fantastic radical history written, on the whole, and especially in the most prestigious institutions, there is a bias in history towards the status quo. And I saw it very vividly in the commemoration of the Irish 1916 Rising, because it's 100 years and two now since we had a rebellion in Ireland to escape the British Empire. And although it was militarily defeated, it precipitated events that have helped the Irish Republic emerge. And I attended a lecture by a very senior Cambridge professor, Charles Townsend, and it was just full of subtle imperial bias from start to finish. And his basic contention was that there was no actual reason for the Easter Rising, that had the British been a bit more sensitive to Irish culture, they could have avoided it. So he had no sensitivity to the fact that we had an atrocious famine in Ireland that was exacerbated by the policies of the British government. No sensitivity at all to why a nation would want to escape an empire. And this, when you hear things like this, it really motivates you then to write the alternative to it. And even going back to the Crusades, I'm looking at the Crusades as someone who's got something of a Jewish background, so I'm looking at it as sort of an outsider. And whereas the Cambridge and Oxford writings about the Crusades tend to be, if anything, somewhat positive to them. I'm not so enthusiastic about their actions, But I still want to understand them. I still want to enter their mental world and